All right, almost there. Give me just one more second. Here we go. All right, good to be back with everyone, and I hope everything is well there. Uh, I am obviously going to focus on the news of the last couple days, and I'm going to try to present some information that I think will help us to focus on a couple different issues that I imagine many of us are concerned about. So the big news, of course, is that Donald Trump was convicted on all 34 counts by a unanimous jury of his peers in New York 2 days ago, bringing to a conclusion the only court case in the four possible court cases that could have come against Trump this year that seems likely to proceed before the election. And there's more to it than that, but I want to focus on two things. And the first is the electoral impact of this. And I think it's quite clear that for almost any other politician, certainly for almost any other era in American politics, this would be a fatal blow. But for Donald Trump, in fact, at least the short term indication seems to be that this may be strengthening his support, strengthening support within his own party, where essentially every leader of note who's gone on record has come to Trump's defense and support and attacked the American legal system, and also obviously generating a record breaking fundraising period for Donald Trump. And in these respects, I want to suggest that it may, at least in the short term, be strengthening Donald Trump. In the long term, I'm not as confident. But having said that, I have no confidence how this is going to affect the election. So I want to focus on a second issue. And this is the issue that I am more confident about, which is that the convicted Donald Trump, if re-elected, will be a more dangerous president for the United States. And so while many of us want to celebrate the vindication of the rule of law, the idea that no person, no matter how powerful, is above the rules and norms that govern our society. And if you break them, even if you're a former president, you will be held to account. I think that's a principle that is absolutely at the center of the normative world that we have built in the United States. It's an institution that is core to our democracy, to our liberty, and to our equality. Having said all of that, I also need to note that the more important verdict, as many people have said, is the verdict that will be delivered on the first Tuesday of November, the verdict delivered by the American people. And if they decide to reelect Donald Trump, and I do think that there is a uh, considerable likelihood at this juncture that that will be the outcome, that the fact that he has been convicted will make him more of a threat to the rule of law, to American democracy. So that's the I'm sorry, rather somber, rather dark argument I want to make with you today. I'll start more with the politics, how this is going to affect the election, and then move into the further analysis about why this makes Trump less restrained, more resentful, more motivated by grievance, more likely to directly target American democracy. So, the verdict: guilty on 34 counts, 11 counts related to invoices, 11 counts related to checks, 12 counts related to ledger entries. And please note, right, I've got on the board the time frame for the four cases that could have been brought to bear this year. And this is an updated diagram. The previous version of this diagram actually showed further progress in two of the other cases, the federal cases, which had dates. Those dates, in fact, have passed, and now there is no start date for those trials. But I just want you to weigh in the balance for a moment that these are what would normally be misdemeanor white collar crimes that Donald Trump was just convicted of. The only reason that he was able to be convicted of them and that they were brought as felony counts is because the argument is that this was in furtherance of election interference. This wasn't just ordinary uh, bookkeeping shenanigans, cooking the books, but an effort to do something that was a felony crime. But please note that the January 6th case alleges that Donald Trump tried to overturn the outcomes of the presidential election he lost, that he did so in part by inciting a violent mob to invade the Congress, and then by failing to use the powers vested in his office to restrain that mob and to protect his vice president and the members of Congress. That in addition to that, he pressured public officials. He participated in a scheme to organize alternative slates of electors. That he spent 2 months in the presidency trying to overturn the results of American democracy. The classified documents case indicates that he took with him from the protected confines of the White House to the very unprotected environs of Mar-a-Lago a whole bunch of classified documents, some of which were extremely valuable in terms of revealing our sources of information and our plans for potential wars, and then expose them to people who had no authorization to see them, engaged in a cover up to try to prevent the government from reclaiming them, right? And so I point all this out because I think the first thing to notice is that although Trump is guilty on all counts, the question of the relative gravity of this verdict compared to what else he's accused of begins to make me wonder how much we should think that this case is the noteworthy case. It will be the only one, it seems likely, that will actually produce results. The results it's produced are conviction. The result is that we now have a felon who is an ex-president running for the presidency, uncharted territory in American democracy. But I'll just point out, right, that the messy collision between law and politics has really just begun. Because the question is, on the one hand, what is going to happen with these other cases? Will there be any progress? What will the Supreme Court do in the case of Donald Trump v. the United States? What will Judge Eileen Cannon do in the Mar-a-Lago documents case? It's entirely difficult to see, but in general, how much will the sustained attack on the American legal system by Donald Trump and his allies, the exercise in identity protecting cognition, if the man you think should be the next president of the United States has been convicted of a felony, and normally being a felon is not an admirable trait, how do you reconcile yourself? How do you resolve the dissonance? Well, by thinking that the American criminal justice system, the American judicial system, the rule of law that that system anchors are so corrupt, are so deeply politicized that one should no longer put any faith in them. And so that's the deep collision that is playing out in real time in our politics. Um, I would point out very quickly, and now I'm going to pivot to an issue that I think is going to be actually extremely important. How much does Joe Biden and his campaign focus on the conviction and more generally on the lawlessness of Donald Trump? Please note that it's not just Donald Trump now who's been convicted, but his former campaign manager, his senior political advisor, his chief White House strategist, his national security advisor, and this former CFO of the Trump organization have all been convicted, right? And so does the Biden campaign choose to focus in part on the fact that Donald Trump associates himself with individuals who show so little respect for the law that they end up in jail? I thought that one of the things the prosecutor said in his summation in the case on, I guess it was Monday, was extremely important and illuminating. He said, look, the prosecution didn't pick Michael Cohen to be our witness. Donald Trump picked Michael Cohen to be his fixer. Why did he choose a man like Michael Cohen, a notorious liar and bully, someone who has stolen, etc., to be his representative? Because he wanted someone who would lie, who had no ethical compass, to do his dirty work for him. That's why we've got to call him as a witness. And then you add the rogues gallery here of other similar people that Trump has associated himself with, surrounded himself with, and demanded loyalty from, loyalty to the point of violating their own ethics and the law, violating any sort of commitment to fidelity or the truth. And you begin to get a sense then of the overall liability that comes with putting this man in the White House for a second time. It seems to me it's a real and important issue. I would add, and there's a high road and a low road, and it's not clear to me that the low road is actually so low in this case. So Joe Biden did speak on these issues yesterday, but he spoke exclusively about the importance of upholding the rule of law and the problem with attacking the American system of criminal justice and the judicial system. And what he avoided, and so far his campaign has mainly avoided, is talking about the details of the case, right? And I wonder whether voters will focus on the details of the case, and if the uh, question of whether or not they will focus on the details of the case will depend in part on whether or not Democrats, whether that is Biden's campaign or somebody else's campaign or a political action committee, will actually run advertisements that call our attention to some of the facts in this case, right? The idea that what Donald Trump did was to have sex with a porn star while married to a supermodel after having had an affair with a play bunny. And by the way, his supermodel wife has just recently given birth to their first child, right? And so the idea that in addition to that, Donald Trump knew that there were sufficiently many of these kinds of stories floating around that he devised a strategy to catch these stories, to keep them from seeing the light of day, that he authorized multiple large expenditures to cover up his past history of infidelity. The fact that this then fits a pattern not only of serial philandering, of cheating on his spouses, but of also engaging in sexual predation, right? And so part of what we see with the Stormy Daniels testimony is how problematic the sexual encounter between her and Donald Trump was. And then, of course, we've got the E. Jean Carroll case in which Trump has been hit with a nearly $100 million verdict in a defamation case, civil case, but related to sexual aggression against another woman. And then finally, the cover up, and in a sense, this is perhaps the least salacious and least damning portion of the case, but the disregard for the law, the disregard for the need for the American people to have information about the person they're voting on, and that this fits a pattern of corrupt business practices, which of course has gotten Trump near $500 million civil verdict for further cases of cooking the books, exaggerating the values of his companies when seeking loans, artificially depressing the value when filing taxes. And the bigger question here, obviously, is why would we want someone with this low character to be president of the United States? And can we agree on the reality that this person is of low character? And that right final question, I'm suggesting to you this is a question that Biden and Democrats are going to have to be asking as a strategic question. How much of their energy do they want to focus on bringing to light the details of this case? And in saying that, I want to focus in particular on what I'm going to call a low information voter. And so we get together every week and we talk about the details of politics. I mainly assume that you have been up to speed on the news of the week, because who else would spend an hour of their Saturday morning every week talking about politics but someone who is actually quite interested in and therefore somewhat well informed about politics. I would point out to you that we are, in fact, exceptional if we are relatively high information voters, people who actually pay attention to the news and what's going on in the world, and that many of our peers, maybe as many as two-thirds of our fellow citizens, are what are called low information voters. These are people, and there are different ways to put this. I'm relying on some now political science jargon, who rely on stylized facts or heuristics. They maybe see the biggest headline. That's why I started with the New York Post, and I'll go back to this for a second, because there are a couple different things about this, right? On the one hand, right, a conservative outlet, a Murdoch paper, right? Guilty on all counts. Donald Trump is now the first ex-president to be convicted on criminal charges. And look at the body language, right? This is the image of a man who has just absorbed a body blow, a humiliating defeat. And for a low information voter, this may be all they know about this case. So part of the question is, do Biden and the Democrats try to inform them about more of what happened here? Is it enough to have the simple heuristic? Donald Trump is now a felon. And that creates dissonance. Do I want a felon as president, without going into, oh, by the way, he's a serial philanderer. He engages in sexual predation and brags about it. He cooks the books at his business on a regular basis. And there's no reason to believe, given all of the people associated with him who ended up in jail while he was president the first time, that he wouldn't continue acting in this way if he occupied the presidency for a second time. And the question is that salient enough to change the minds of some voters? And here I'm going to start drilling down on some of the information that I think is relevant to making up our minds about this issue. On the one hand, please note that Joe Biden is losing support primarily among these low information voters. These voters who did not vote in 2020 have swung from being nearly plus 10 for Biden to being nearly plus 14 for Trump. A lot of what we're seeing in the polls reflects these voters who did not vote last time, who do not follow politics very closely, and who may not be particularly likely to vote in 2024. Among voters who actually voted in 2020, Biden has lost a little bit of support, but not nearly as much. So who are we talking about in particular? And I think in particular, voters who are considering voting for Trump for the first time, right? These are not dyed in the wool, make America great again Republicans. They're people who maybe haven't voted before or haven't voted since Barack Obama was on the ballot and who are considering voting for Trump in 2024. And in particular, the big swing here is among younger people and people of color. And so those are the people that emphasizing these attributes of Trump and using the conviction to make this clear and salient, I think have the most likelihood of reaching and maybe changing their minds. Obviously, and I'll say more about this as we get further into this, I don't think that the convinced Make America Great voters and those who are living on the Fox News diet, the Trump supporters, the dyed in the wool Trump supporters, are going to have their minds changed by this. If anything, the evidence seems to be that they are more likely to support a convicted Donald Trump. It plays into the idea that he is their hero who is willing to martyr himself in order to stand up for them, that the entire system is rigged against them. That has been their lived, felt experience for many of them for 20 or 30 years, and that the system is so deeply rigged that the first politician that they feel gets them and stands up for them is going to be taken down in whatever way possible. We'll say more about that, but so I don't think, right, that this conviction changes the dynamic for the core Trump supporters. The big question then, and this is, I think, one that Biden and his team will be watching, that we should be watching too, is whether or not Biden goes up in the polls in the next few weeks, and then how long that lasts. Please note that the next big date in the political calendar is June 27th, when Biden and Trump will have their first debate. So it's the period between now and the end of the month that I think may help the Biden campaign to determine whether they can turn this development to their advantage. Now, talking about these low information voters, I will just return your memory to the fact for a moment that the vast majority of Americans support a federally guaranteed right to abortion, that includes a large portion of Republicans. And yet, when you ask people who is responsible for ending the federally guaranteed right to abortion, and you put that in terms of Trump, Biden, or don't know, well, 56% of the people get the answer right. It's Donald Trump who appointed the three new members to the court that ultimately resulted in the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. But 17% think it's Biden, 13% don't know. So you're up to 30% of the American population not having any idea really how Roe v. Wade got overturned or being factually inaccurate about that. And so again, this is the kind of voter that I think Biden has to take into account. and we'll drill down on this for a moment. Um, these voters, right, are spread throughout the country, but they really matter in 6 states, right, in the swing states. Assuming that Biden holds every state that he won in 2020 by 6 or more percentage points, if not, this race is probably over. Then does he actually win enough of the battleground states that he won in 2020 to win the election? And I think most people think that Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin are the most important states. And please note that he is doing much better among likely voters in those states than he is among all voters in those states. So, looking then in detail at how the conviction of Donald Trump is likely to alter people's votes. Note, right, that a fair number of people had already made up their mind before the verdict came in, that 34% of Republicans said that a conviction would make it more likely that they would support Trump. And that is obviously being reflected in what we're seeing in the energy going into Trump's campaign in terms of donations in the aftermath of the conviction. But to drill down on this is a different poll, but I think the numbers align pretty well. 9% saying it would make it less likely that they would support Trump. Here, 80% of Trump supporters say if convicted, they would continue to support Trump, but 16% say they would reconsider supporting him, and 4% say they would no longer support him. And I'll just point out to you, given the razor thin margins by which the last two presidential elections have been decided, if 4% of voters really pulled away, of Trump supporters pulled away from Trump, if, right, 36% of independents maybe move away from Trump as a result of this conviction, this could be enough to determine the outcome of this election. I need to immediately hedge what I just said by noting that one thing we know about polls, and polls are notoriously unreliable at predicting behavior. They maybe give us an accurate snapshot at what people are thinking right now, but one thing that seems to be clear is that voters are not very good at answering hypothetical questions. If this, then that. If Trump is convicted, what would you do? They may say one thing while that's a question on a survey, right? But end up doing something very different by the time it comes to election day. And so I think one question with these 4% is, um, are they really open to changing their minds? What are they going to be hearing on the media? I don't know about you. I watched Fox News for about an hour the evening on which Trump was convicted, and doing so made it clear that there will be a sustained attack on the prosecution, on the jury, on the judge, and that truth, accuracy will be no constraint on what is said, right? The same thing is true about the speech Donald Trump gave yesterday in Trump Tower. Complete fabrication. And so these people who have supported Trump up until now are going to hear an exculpatory story, right? The only reason Trump has been convicted on these crimes is because the DA was out to get him, because Biden was out to get him, because the deep state is out to get him. There was no crime. And by the way, we go back to the idea that the crimes that he's been convicted of are relatively unimportant white collar bookkeeping crimes. And so the idea that the only reason Trump was prosecuted is because he's Trump has a certain kind of credibility to it in this case. I will just point to one or two more things, generally speaking, about the state of the race and how this may influence it. Please note, right, that when we get to registered voters and likely voters, the advantage that Trump has in the polls vanishes. Now, again, this is national data. What really matters is Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and I think there's a narrative that's kind of taken hold. Biden is dead in the water. The Democrats need to find a different candidate at their convention this summer, and I don't think that that's what the polls are showing. And then to note one more thing here, right? In a different category than one we've looked at before, personal favorability, right? This is not job approval. This is just kind of, do you think this person is a decent person? Joe Biden doesn't do well, but he does a fair bit better than Donald Trump. And again, bringing to light, increasing the focus on the conduct that got Trump convicted, I can only guess would raise his unfavorability rating with those who are not just diehard Trump supporters already. So, now let's pivot back to the overall race, and I think one of the critical questions is, how much will the fact that Trump is convicted matter to voters? And here I want to suggest that we need to avoid falling into the trap that thinking that 2024 is a replay of 2020. In 2020, Donald Trump was the president. He had broken all kinds of norms, laws, rules, been impeached, mismanaged the COVID pandemic. Obviously, I am emphasizing the negative with regards to what President Trump had done in his 4 years in office, but in part that's because it's important to recognize on what basis he lost that election, right? And lost that election to opponent who's not a particularly gifted politician, especially on the campaign trail. But 2024, Biden is now the incumbent. And so this election will be as much a referendum on Biden as it is on Trump. And so I would suggest that the economy, inflation, immigration, abortion, peace, that these issues, right, which if we look at who's moving away from Biden, right, people who think the economy is poor, who want fundamental change, get their news from a certain kind of social media, and are concerned about inflation, right? And note again, right, the idea that 70% of the electorate wants fundamental major change in our political and economic system, and Joe Biden really does not seem to be the right person to bring about fundamental major change. That's not his role. That's not his personality. That's not his history. That's not our experience with him for the last 4 years. And so I do want to suggest, right, that these issues remain focal and that part of what Joe Biden and his team are going to have to do is to convince Americans that it's not just that Donald Trump is a felon and has bad character and is likely to be lawless again in the White House, but to convince them that Joe Biden will be a better president for the economy, that the immigration crisis is not his fault alone, and that in fact he has a better prospect of fixing it, and Donald Trump has got in the way. That the peace plan that was announced yesterday by Joe Biden, which I really should be talking with you about because I think it's incredibly important, is much more likely to succeed than anything Donald Trump can offer, and that there's a real and important way in which Joe Biden has exercised leadership in foreign policy and world politics that has kept the world from being a more dangerous place than it would be with a president who was less focused and experienced when it came to international affairs, that there needs to be a positive case made for Joe Biden. And then we need also to raise the question, I think, as a fundamental question. Do we want to sustain democracy and its core institutions as we have them? Yes, we want major change. Yes, we know that democracy is not working well for us. But do we believe that the system is so corrupt, so damaged, that actually we want to bring a wrecking ball into the White House? And if that is the case, then we probably should vote for Donald Trump. Can that issue be tied to the issue of conviction in a way that plausibly makes the case to Americans this system of government, as flawed as it is, as much as it has failed us over the last 50 years, needs to be reformed rather than wrecked? So that is the range of issues that it seems to me are brought up by this case in terms of the politics of a campaign year and how they play out. I'm going to stop now and pivot to a second set of issues. And these, it seems to me, are not independent, right? Part of the question here is, do we want to give Donald Trump a second term? And that's not just about what policies he would enact, but it's also about how he would use the tremendous power vested in the office he would hold. And so the thing I want to suggest to you is that the conviction yesterday makes it more likely that he would be more dangerous as a second term president. That's in part because it will deepen his sense of grievance that the system of rules and laws that structure American democracy and liberty are rigged against him and the people that he stands up for, that he needs to tear down that system. It was also the case, and here I think this is critical, right? You look at the juxtaposition between Donald Trump the evening he is convicted and Donald Trump less than 24 hours in Trump Tower giving, quote, a press conference, which is really just a rambling speech filled with lies and disinformation. And it is clear that Trump has, in fact, been emboldened, right? He was clearly demoralized on Thursday evening. By Friday at noon, he had new energy. Why? Because his campaign had had record fundraising, because none of his allies had turned against him, but in fact had redoubled their support for him, because Fox News had reliably fallen into line, as had the whole right wing media ecosystem, in suggesting that the only reason he was convicted is because this whole thing was a rigged witch hunt. And so the idea that there's an impunity here, that Trump can do whatever he wants and get away with it, that if he's elected, he's not going to jail, that if he is elected, it means that there's nothing more that anybody can really do to damage him, and so he doesn't have to worry about legal or social accountability. He is already leaning into this outlaw image, right? That he is someone who does not respect the elite niceties of laws that would prevent him from standing up for his followers, his supporters, and that image actually mobilizes his core base. It makes it more likely that Donald Trump will continue to break laws, become more aggressive in his use of power and his disregard for institutional constraints in a second term. So, this is the object lessons I believe he's drawn. The indictments over a year ago now revived his candidacy. The conviction generated record fundraising. The impeachments led the party to fall in line behind him. It really sorted out the party, cut wheat from chaff, and the non-MAGA Republicans have fallen away. The party is completely his. Finally, this is not directly related to the conviction, but I think extremely important that Trump has learned a lot from his first term in office about not surrounding himself with people who are more institutional Republicans, but instead surrounding himself by loyalists, and that he is increasingly supported by a team of strategists and lawyers who are seeking to overcome the institutional constraints of the presidency. That means the rule of law and checks and balances, right? And the Heritage Foundation, his former advisors, are already organizing efforts to rework the number of federal appointments that he will have within the civil service, the degree of loyalty that he can demand from career civil servants, to remake the executive branch so that it really does operate as a unified instrument of the power of the presidency. And so then the question would be, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, if he's got this stronger sense of grievance and impunity, if he has more detailed and better equipped strategies for overcoming the impediments of the office, will he succeed? Or will other institutions check and balance him? And here I'm going to suggest very quickly three institutions that might constrain him: the Republican Party, the media, and the judiciary. And I'm going to suggest that all three of them have been weakened, undermined, or co opted. And so that should Donald Trump regain the presidency, the convicted felon Donald Trump will be less constrained in his second term. I'm going to reprise information we've talked about together before very quickly to indicate why I think each of the three pillars that could potentially constrain Trump are weakened to the point where they would no longer serve as a check. In order to do so, I'm going to start with the idea that Trump has an authoritarian personality. And that the authoritarian personality that perhaps was apparent in his first term will be much less restrained in his second term. I turn back to Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat's 2018 book on how democracies die. And so this checklist, right, the four key indicators of authoritarian behavior: they reject uh, the rules of the game that constitute a democracy. They deny the legitimacy of their political opponents. Again, I think we're seeing this in spades in Trump's reaction to the verdict. They have toleration of or encourage violence. And of course, we saw this in what happened on January 6th and the invasion of the Capitol. Readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. We've seen Trump label large portions of the media fake news. We hear him saying he's going to round up and lock up immigrants. We hear him talking about using the Justice Department to prosecute the Trump crime family, right? And so a quick summary. He throws out the referees, denies opponents legitimacy, tolerates and encourages violence, changes the rules of the game. Levitsky and Zablat, who studied over 100 cases of democracy being thrown from within, said those are the four key attributes of a typical person who overthrows democracy from within. And then they scored Donald Trump and they came up with an authoritarian scorecard that made Trump by far and away the most authoritarian president the United States has ever had. And I would suggest to you again that these attributes are only going to be enhanced and more prominent in a second Trump presidency. And so this is a reason to really focus on the issue, right? Should we be electing Donald Trump, even if we don't particularly like the job that Joe Biden has done with the economy, with inflation, even if we're worried that there's an immigration crisis and the world is less safe under Joe Biden than it was under Donald Trump? Don't sacrifice the baby with the bathwater. Don't sacrifice the system of government that we have. And here, I think it's going to be extremely important for Democrats, many of whom have deep reservations about Joe Biden, to nevertheless work very hard to reelect Joe Biden because he stands between us and a second Trump term, which could be a disaster for democracy. Similarly, I think it's going to be incumbent upon those of us who are worried that if Trump does win, he will be a genuine threat to democracy, to be thinking about the strategies that we would use in a second Trump term to resist the authoritarian drift. I won't quote Levitsky and Zablat again, but I would point out to you that their central takeaway, which is that democracies are most likely to be overthrown from within, from the people that are elected, who then use the power of their office to undermine the institutional structure that requires that they have restrained power, stand for regular election, let the other party check them, especially if they win elections. And so I do think we really do have to recognize that their conclusion is that America is not special, is not immune or exempt from democratic undermining. Here again, just a little bit about what Trump says about himself and how likely it is that his followers are going to be persuaded that the conviction is not genuine or a reason not to support him. And to note, right, that part of the reason Trump is able to make the case credibly that the only reason he's been convicted is because the system is stacked against him is because so many Americans believe that the system is stacked against them and that Donald Trump is the first politician in living memory to actually say that out loud and effectively give voice to their complaint, their grievance, their justified demand that this system be upended so that it works better. Trump says, I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those of you who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. He then goes on to say that America is going to hell in a handbasket, particularly around immigration, but in general. And he says, That's why I'm standing before you, because we are going to finish what we started. We started something that was a miracle. We're going to complete the mission. We're going to see this battle through to ultimate victory. I am your warrior. I am your justice. That's the full context. And here I just want to point then to begin with why we should not expect the Republican Party to be any break on Donald Trump as it was on, for instance, Richard Nixon. The party has been completely remade. And the level of obsequiousness that we saw in the trial, with so many of the leaders of the party coming to the court, standing with Trump, right? It's a kind of display of the way in which thuggishness demands loyalty, even in the face of allegations and eventual conviction for criminality, right? And so Matthew Continetti, who's no fan of Joe Biden, Nicole Hemmer, who's done a really important history of the growing partisanship of the Republican Party and the right wing media, demonstrate, right, that this is a party that has been really taken over by its far right wing, and that the right wing of of the Republican Party will now simply parrot, ape the lies of Donald Trump, as we see, for instance, in the idea that the election of 2020 was won only through fraud, and the increasing belief of the rank and file of the Republican Party that that is true. And again, just to drill down on this, the movement of the Republican Party into a right wing exclusionary populist party is a movement that is occurring throughout the democratic world. This is not just Trump and the Republican Party. This is occurring for structural reasons because so many people believe that democracy is not working for them and they want a stronger, less restrained leader to stand up for them. Um, this has become banal. This has become normal. This has become routine. And I think that the leadership of the Republican Party, the voters of the Republican Party, increasingly feel that Donald Trump is not a norm breaker, but a normal politician. And it's the Democrats who are out of step with the current drift of opinion and politics. This is in part because there's this sense that a weak liberal politician can't control the influx of immigration and the transformation of the American population into a much more diverse and, for some people, therefore, much less comfortable population. The sense that our traditions no longer hold, that our economy has become much more unequal, and that our political institutions are doing nothing about this. And there is truth to this, right? That average Americans' opinions have very little influence on what actually happens in our politics, that the economic elite are the only ones who have any kind of responsiveness from democratic institutions in the 21st century. And the result is a steady decline in the support for liberal democracy. We add to that, and now I'm turning to the media. This is some new and I think quite interesting research. The title is Republicans Cheer Louder and Boo Harder, looking at when the presidency changes, how the parties, members of each party, regard the economy, right? So when Barack Obama is president, Democrats think the economy is doing better, Republicans think it's doing worse. When Trump becomes president, Republicans think the economy is doing better, vice versa with Democrats. and it switches again when Biden becomes president. So there's a partisan shaping of perceptions of the economic state of the country. But having said that, it's not equal. It's not symmetrical. What the data shows is when a Democrat is in president, Democratic views go up 5 to 6%, Republican views go down 14 to 20%. When a Republican is in the presidency, Democratic views go down 6%, roughly symmetrical. Republican views go up 15 to 20%. Why are Republicans so much more exaggerated in their partisan perception of reality than Democrats? My simple suggestion is because they occupy a confirming media echo chamber much more than the Democrats do. In saying that, I'm looking at some research that is done on the way in which the immigration issue was framed and introduced in the 2016 campaign, and more generally on the way in which the media environment you occupy shapes your political beliefs. If you read newspapers, 70% chance that you're going to support Joe Biden. There's some self selection, right? Biden supporters may be more likely to read newspapers, but the information world that you live in makes it more likely that you're going to support Joe Biden. If you don't follow the political news, or if you get your political news primarily from the internet, from social media, or from cable news sites, much more likely to support Donald Trump, right? And this then reflects the idea that a large segment of our media system still operates in the way that it's supposed to, but a substantial segment, the right wing media ecosystem, has become an identity confirming system. The news is shaped to reinforce the identity of the people watching the news. And this makes it highly unlikely that the media will check Donald Trump in a second term. The Republican Party won't, the media won't. I'm going to skip ahead. This is stuff I've shared with you before about the way in which a networked public sphere has been transformed, about the far right bent of the right wing media ecosystem, about the prevalence of disinformation. But I want to get to the third idea here, and that is that the judiciary is much less likely to restrain Donald Trump. I couldn't help myself. I've got a little cartoon of Alito, right, who has been flying Trump flags and saying there's no need to recuse himself. Um, but I want to be serious about this, right? The judiciary is supposed to be the nonpartisan branch of our three branch system of government. We elect the other two branches, the judiciary is appointed. We make the other two branches susceptible to frequent reelection. The appointment to the Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment that's supposed to insulate the justices from political pressure and allow them to show fidelity to the Constitution as opposed to a particular party. What worries me with the questions that Alito asked during the Trump v. the United States, the case about presidential immunity, is that it indicated that Alito was every bit as partisan as are the current members of Congress. And I would point out to you, it's not just Alito. You can say this about other justices perhaps as well. But I just think that that case makes it clear, right? Donald Trump has appointed 3 members to this court. 6 members of this court are very conservative by historical standards. The reason that the only case that has actually gone to trial against Trump is the weakest of the three cases is because that is the case that isn't in the federal judiciary. Please note that the January 6th case is held up, waiting for the court to consider Trump's claim to absolute immunity. The documents case is held up because, in part, the judge handling it is a judge appointed by Donald Trump more for ideological reasons than for reasons of judicial competence or virtue. And I want to be careful here. I'm not completely giving up on the federal bench and the Supreme Court. I believe there are some institutional pressures that moderate the conduct of the justices. I believe actually that the Federalist Society and conservative legal activists are not merely partisan activists, although their view of the Constitution aligns much better with Republican politics than with Democratic politics. I just worry deeply that what I think would have been obvious a few years ago when Trump was in the presidency the first time, that the Supreme Court could be a check of last resort, is no longer the case. And so having said all that, then the conclusion is not only would a second Donald Trump term put a man who would be vindictive, aggrieved, and convinced that the judiciary, the legal system, was completely politically partisan and instrumental, that it had been used against him and now he should be free to use it against his opponents. But it would also be a term in which the constraints, the guardrails, would be very much weakened and diminished. And so the danger would be even more grave than it was during the first Trump presidency. How's that for a nice rosy report on the good news of the Trump conviction? With apologies, let me open it up for discussion. Who wants to start us out? Flossie, go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
But this will be, I'm going back to that moment in our history when Barack Obama was our president and made his first address to the Congress. He was speaking. Whether or not you voted for him, you owed him the dignity of your attention. Obama made some remark, I forget it was what it was, but I did hear Alito call out, "You lie." I think I mentioned it at the time, and people said, "Oh, Posse poo-poo, it wasn't him, it was someone else." It was Alito. Saying to the elected president, "You lie." For me, not only was it a sign of disrespect and stupidity, but it was racist.
Well, see, I do have to.
I'm just, let me finish. I may be wrong. I think Alito felt that he could treat a Black man with disrespect. I have found nothing to remove that suspicion. Also, and this is a big joke, let's laugh. When Justice Roberts was being interrogated with great respect and gentleness by Democratic senators to become one of our Supreme Court justices and possibly the head of the group, he weaseled his way out of making any statement which would indicate where his political opinions live. It was uh, so frustrating finally that one congressman interrogating him said, um, could you possibly tell us what your favorite movie is? Well, Supreme Court justices go to the movies. And Justice Roberts finally had to give in. He averred that his favorite movie was North by Northwest, where you have an airplane zooming in on Cary Grant, who's running away from uh, possibly some Nazi organization, but I doubt that. Even if it was a big joke, the disrespect of that answer, that he was just my favorite movie, ha ha ha, North by Northwest. I have never trusted the man. What a silly thing. Based on what he called his favorite movie, I submit that can tell you a hell of a lot. That's it.
So Flossie, I am gonna point out that it was Joe Wilson, a Republican congressman, who shouted out "You lie" during Barack Obama's State of the Union address. Alito vigorously shook his head no in response to what Obama had to say about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court in 2010. So Alito did something that no other Supreme Court justice in my memory has done, which is demonstrably disagreed with the president during the State of the Union address. He didn't actually say "you lie," and I do think that one of the things that's on display here is how little self-awareness Alito seems to have about the way in which his behavior seems to reflect a partisan stance that at least many of us think is inappropriate for a Supreme Court justice. This is obvious in the way in which he's responded to the requests that he recuse himself recently and a while back with an article, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal. He just thinks that he is the best judge of his own impartiality, which is a peculiar thing to think. And so again, with Alito, with Roberts, with a majority of conservative justices on the Supreme Court delaying the trial of the former president in order to consider the idea that he might have immunity for that act, to the point where it seems highly unlikely that that case will be able to proceed before the election. That is, to my mind, sufficient to question whether the court can serve as an effective check on Donald Trump. I'm going to say one more thing here very quickly. And so James Madison in Federalist number 10, and then he redoubles it in Federalist 51, says, we can count on each of these institutions checking and balancing the other, not because they read my papers and internalize my philosophy, but because the institutions will generate interests that will lead them to want to stand up for their institution against the other institution's effort to intrude on the power or aggrandize the office. And I think what Madison didn't take into account is the idea that a political party could be powerful enough that fidelity to the party would matter more than standing up for the power of the institution. I think that's what we see in the Trump impeachment trials, right? And that the Senate doesn't want to check the power of the president, not because it doesn't want the presidency constrained, but because the members of the Senate who would have to vote are in the same party, and they're going to put party above the institutional logic of the Senate. And so the same thing is happening with the Supreme Court, it seems to me. It's increasingly a partisan institution, and due to some bad luck and some problems with the overrepresentation of the minority in the Senate and the Electoral College, we now have a Republican appointed super majority in the Senate. All right. Thank you, Flossie. Anybody else with a comment for today? Ruth, I saw your comment in the chat. I thought I kind of spoke to it. Do you want to follow up on that?
No, maybe I missed it. I just wondered what you thought, how Biden should handle this. But if you've already discussed it, I missed it.
Well, my suggestion is that Biden and his team have to look at the polls. They have to look at the way in which the electorate reacts to this, and they have to be pretty fine grained. They got to pay a lot of attention to Michigan and Pennsylvania and young voters and voters of color and first time voters and see if they're getting a bump, and if so, how long it lasts, and whether that's sufficient to begin to then say, we've got an opening here. Let's take advantage of it, right? Because I think the danger is that if you say, look, Trump's a convicted felon, not only that, he's a philanderer and somebody who engages in sexual predation, somebody who regularly cooks his books, you end up looking like you're trying to change the conversation away from your failures as president, right? And I do think that Biden has a tough road to hoe here, right? He has to be able to convince the American people that his failures as president are not so bad that they should throw in with Donald Trump, right? And to be able to take some credit. And here I would speak to some of my friends. You know, I don't know if John is here today, but he's one of the people with whom I have this conversation occasionally. I think that Joe Biden has been, in many respects, a pretty good president, and I'm not sure that he's as incapacitated as some people like to make him out to be. And we have to be able to stand up for. The Biden campaign, Joe Biden has to be able to stand up for what he has accomplished and suggest, yes, American democracy is not working well for many of us. Yes, many of us are pinched by inflation. We're falling back on credit cards because we can't afford our lives anymore, and the credit card interest is exorbitant. The result is that the path that we had to what looks like solvency is receding further and further away. And I understand that you're angry and discontent about that, but don't believe that the other guy is going to do better or has policies that better respond to these circumstances than mine. I've done my best so far, and give me a second term, I will do more. And that's the tricky case he's going to have to make. And focusing exclusively on Trump as a threat to democracy, as important as that is. I want to be as clear as possible. I am sounding the alarm bell. But having said that, I don't know that that's an issue that wins Biden a second term, because I think many Americans are soured on democracy in 2024. They don't share the sense of panic that putting someone in the White House who might use the powers of the presidency to undermine democracy is necessarily such a bad thing. That's a chilling fact, but if it's accurate, it's one that then the Biden campaign has to take seriously. It's got to try to win with the electorate where it's at. It can't choose a different electorate. Does that help a little bit more, Ruth? Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
That's good. Good. Anybody else with a thought or a question for today? All right. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Good as always being with you. Obviously, this was a moment many of us were waiting for. I will, I think, go back to talking about Israel and the peace plan next week. We'll have to see what comes up between now and then, but that's my intention. Be well. Have a good week. See everybody next week. Thank you, guys. Bye bye.